This is how we're going to compute the tax on long-term capital gains. First of all, take a look at the image that I have uploaded onto Brightspace. You can see on the left-hand side, these are the tax rates on ordinary income. This is taken off of Schedule X for a single individual. And you can see that we start at $0 in the 10% bracket, work our way up to the 12% bracket, then 22 and 24, 32%, 35, and at the very top, the 37% bracket. That is just the tax on ordinary income. We've been calculating the taxes on ordinary income ever since we first started studying tax long ago. Now, for long-term capital gains, take a look at the right-hand scale. You can see that starts at 0%. So long-term capital gains start out not taxed at all. And then, as you work your way up, you get a threshold which is almost the same threshold amount, but not quite the same as the threshold amount between the 12 and 22% brackets for ordinary income. Now at the top on the right-hand side, you've got the threshold between 15% and 20%. You see that there. So now we have these two scales, one for taxing ordinary income, one for taxing long-term capital gains. And don't forget that when we say long-term capital gains, we're also including qualified dividends. So in the middle, you see the income, ordinary on the bottom, and then it's labeled LTCG for long-term capital gain on the top. Remember to include any qualified dividends in the top portion with the long-term capital gains. Okay, so now we have them stacked, ordinary on the bottom, long-term capital gain on the top. Make sure you stack them that way because we're going to calculate the tax on ordinary income first. So do that first using Schedule X. And in this case, we've got $450,000 of ordinary income and $100,000 of long-term capital gains. Calculate the tax on the $450,000 first. We know how to do that. We've been doing that since forever. Subtract out the bottom of the bracket. In this case, we're in the 35% bracket. Subtract out the bottom of the bracket. What's left is all taxed at 35%. So there's your tax on that portion. And then the tax on the bottom of the bracket, you can read that right off of Schedule X and then add the two together. And there is your tax on ordinary income. Next, compute your tax on the $100,000 of long-term capital gain. Some of that is going to be taxed at 15%, and the amount that is taxed at 15% is whatever it takes to get the total, including the ordinary income, up to the threshold between the 15 and 20% tax rates. In this example, as I said, none of our capital gain is going to be taxed at 0%. We start at 15, and then we're going to move some of it into the 20%. But first, what's the tax on the 15%? How much will it take to get up to that threshold? Well, there's your amount there. Multiply that by 15%, and that's the first part of the tax on the long-term capital gain. And then how much do we have that is in excess of the threshold? You see that there. Multiply that by 20%. Now add those two numbers together, and that is your total tax on the long-term capital gain. Add that to the tax that we already computed on ordinary income, and you have your total tax. Let's check, make sure we understand what we did. You've calculated the tax. Your client calls you up and says, oh, wait, I forgot to tell you. There's another $10,000. It's a long-term capital gain. I'm sorry. I hope I didn't mess you up. I'm sorry for not telling you about that before. I just discovered it. And you say, well, that's okay. Let's see. I don't have to change anything about how I calculated ordinary income. Ordinary income didn't change. Only long-term capital gain changed. And I also don't have to change anything about how I calculated the 15% on long-term capital gain because the amount of capital gain up to the 15 to 20% threshold has not changed. The only thing that's changed is the amount of capital gain in excess of the threshold. That's gone up by $10,000, so that's taxed at 20%. The new number at 20%, we've got our new tax, and add those together, and you get your total tax on long-term capital gain. Add that to the tax on ordinary income, and you've got your new total income tax. So again, you think you're done, and your client calls you again and says, oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. It turns out that $10,000, it wasn't a long-term capital gain. It was a short-term capital gain. Well, okay, now we've got to add it to ordinary income instead of adding it to the long-term capital gains. Short-term capital gains are taxed just like interest and salary and other types of ordinary income. So our ordinary income has gone up from $450,000 to $460,000. Well, we're still in the 35% bracket, so subtract out the bottom of the bracket and multiply what's left by 35%, and then add in the tax on the bottom of the bracket, and you've got your new tax on ordinary income. Now go do your long-term capital gain. That has also changed because the portion that will get us up to the 15 to 20% threshold is now less, and the portion that's above the 20% threshold is more. So calculate the portion up to the threshold, multiply that by 15%, there's your number there, then multiply the portion in excess of the threshold by 20%, there's your number there. Add those two together, that's your new tax on the long-term capital gain. Add that to your new tax on ordinary income, and there's your total income tax. Now, let's just make sure we understand what we did. We've got three different examples here. In the first one, that's our baseline. We had $450,000 of ordinary income and $100,000 of long-term capital gain. So we have our total tax there. That's our baseline. Then we changed it by adding a $10,000 long-term capital gain, and the tax went up by $2,000. Well, we know why that is. Nothing happened to the tax on ordinary income. Nothing happened to the 15% portion of the tax on long-term capital gain. The only thing that changed was we added $10,000 that was taxed at 20%, and that's why it's a $2,000 increase. For the third example, where we added $10,000 of ordinary income, what happened there? Well, it went up by $4,000. The $10,000 of additional ordinary income taxed at 35%, well, that's only $3,500. Where did the other $500 come from? It came from pushing the long-term capital gain up $10,000 higher so that $10,000 less is taxed at 15%, $10,000 more is taxed at 20%. 5% difference times $10,000, that's your other $500. So that's how you do it. That's how you calculate tax on income where some of that income is a long-term capital gain.